Presentation will focus on the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. This conflict has deep-seated roots and has become increasingly troubling during recent times. Understanding a bit of the history of this conflict will help when examining it with regard to international relations. Ukraine has long been a divided nation, and the two main examples of this division can be seen in politics and language. The conflict regarding language can be dated back to the 17th century when Russia forced settlement of nationalist Russians into Ukraine, which essentially changed the landscape of the nation, making a greater number of people there linguistically and culturally Russian. During the 1930s, Joseph Stalin created conditions of famine in Ukraine, which killed millions, and he also increased the settlement of nationalist Russians in Ukraine during this time. The results of the 2010 Ukrainian election are evident of the divide among individuals across the nation. The eastern part of the nation voted primarily for opposition leader Viktor Yanukovych, which is marked in blue, while the western portion of Ukraine, marked in red, yellow, and green, primarily showed support for Yulia Tymoshenko, who was the Prime Minister of Ukraine at the time. These results very closely mirror the linguistic and cultural differences among individuals across the country. Eastern Ukraine is largely pro-Russia, while the western portion of the nation shows support for increased Ukrainian participation in the European Union. Upon his re-election in 2014, Viktor Yanukovych abandoned talks that would strengthen Ukraine's position within the EU and accepted a debt reduction package of $15 billion from Russian President Vladimir Putin. During this agreement, Putin also decreased gas prices by 1/3 for Ukrainian use. The election and subsequent ties to Russia ignited multiple protests across the country, which formed the basis for the current conflict. After Viktor Yanukovych's re-election in 2014, his government passed quite extensive anti-protest laws. During this time, protesters showed their opposition for Yanukovych and his government and increased their demonstrations across the country, although they were primarily located in the West. During February of 2014, protesters assembled in the capital city of Kiev and ultimately took control of multiple government buildings, which forced Yanukovych to flee, and a warrant was set for his arrest. During that protest, 80 individuals were killed by uniformed officials. After the annexation of Crimea in March of 2014, acting President Alexander Turchinov called for anti-terrorist operations against pro-Russian separatists in the east. In late May, Ukrainian parliament elected Petro Poroshenko as the new president. In July of 2014, pro-Russian rebels shot down Malaysian Flight 17 using missiles that were provided by Putin and the Russian government, which killed 298 people. Later this month, the United States and the European Union enacted new sanctions against Russia. Understanding the long and involved history of this conflict makes it much easier to identify what type of conflict this is and what levels of analysis can be used to explain it. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia can be classified as a limited war, which means that one state engages with another to prevent certain actions or to change behaviors of either the government or the citizens. And this can be classified as a limited war in that while it's not using all of its possible resources to engage in the conflict, the Russian government is aiding Ukrainian separatist rebels in the eastern portion of the country to help stop further integration of Ukraine into the European Union. Russia and Ukrainian separatists are trying to further divide the tumultuous nation by using harsh nationalistic rhetoric and attacking the Ukrainian government. There are three main levels of analysis that can be used to explain this conflict, the first of which is individual. Because citizens in Ukraine have been very active in opposing Russian intervention in their country. The massive protests and public outcry that ousted Viktor Yanukovych from power and brought new leadership has also helped in pushing back Russian military action and separatist operations in the east. This conflict can also be viewed as domestic because there is strong nationalism coming from individuals in eastern Ukraine. Also, there has been strife regarding foreign policy discussions with regard to cooperation with the European Union and integration into the larger European market. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine can also be viewed as economic because many problems in Ukraine stem from financial and cultural divides. Ukraine's economic crisis, financial corruption from government officials, combined with feuds between top oligarchs, has severely fractured the nation, leaving it susceptible to collapse and violence. This conflict can also be viewed as interstate due to Russia's invasion of the country, Putin's support for separatist rebels, and financial amnesty to Viktor Yanukovych. Russia backed the ousted president to decrease the chances for Ukraine to integrate further with Western society and seek participation in NATO. NATO participation was supported in the West and by presidential candidate Yulia Tymoshenko. This conflict can be viewed in three ways. First and foremost, territorial. Pro-Russian rebels in the Russian government have been trying to take over the eastern portion of Ukraine for many years. The pushback from the new Ukrainian government and protesters has led to several large attacks, although many casualties. After the annexation of Crimea, Russia was increasingly uncomfortable with Ukraine further integrating itself into the European Union and the expansion of NATO eastward. It is evident that this conflict also qualifies as governmental based on the upheaval and strife after both the 2010 and 2014 elections. Western Ukraine wanted to strengthen ties with other Western nations, while Eastern Ukraine wanted to remove itself and become independent or become part of Communist Russia. The financial crisis in Ukraine marks this as an economic conflict as well. This crisis severely weakened Ukraine's economy. This, combined with the unpaid bills that Ukraine had with Russia over the gas supply, escalated conflicts. Russia has multiple times cut off the supply line to Ukraine, leaving residents without fuel to heat their homes and businesses, especially during the winter months. After signing the gas price agreement with then-President Yanukovych, the Kremlin dramatically increased the price of fuel later that year. The events between Russia and Ukraine can also be looked at as an unconventional conflict. The aid given to pro-Russian separatists by the Kremlin is widely viewed as state-sponsored terrorism. As an example often cited is the use of Russian missiles by separatist rebels to shoot down Malaysian Flight 17 over Ukraine. The US and many other international organizations condemned Russian participation in this conflict by imposing stronger sanctions. The European Union detailed specific actions taken by the Russians and separatist rebels, categorizing them as terrorism, namely the seizure of aircraft, the supply and acquisition of weapons, actions that resulted in civilian casualties, and destruction of government and transportation structures. As this conflict is still ongoing, it is not likely that an end is in the near future. Only time will tell if a peaceful solution can be reached between the two countries. This solution, however, may possibly have to be brokered by either the European Union or the United Nations to protect citizens and hold those who engaged in destructive acts